previous Rebbe, when he came to America, made this very strong emotional statement. We are here in a place of safety and comfort, and Jews in Europe are in terrible danger. Are we better than them? Is this supposed to tell us that we deserve better than those Jews? Not so. Here's what the Rebbe said. I consider every Jew in Europe a tzaddik, even if he doesn't put on tefillin. A tzaddik. That's a Jewish leader. That's Jewish thinking. We are never the accusing angel. Let's talk about one particular mitzvah that we can all improve in, and that is the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew. Ahavas Yisrael. We really don't need to justify at all the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew as yourself, which seems to be a little particular, a little parochial. Why only your fellow Jew? Nobody gets bent out of shape if you love your children more than the neighbor's children. If you put their interest before others, if you put your family before others, if you put your community before others, if you put your nation before others. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, if you can't find the motivation to take your own seriously and responsibly, then how can you be expected to extend that to others? So yes, you have to love your fellow Jew as yourself. There's a separate mitzvah of loving the stranger, but it doesn't say as yourself, because that may not be possible. If it's not your flesh and blood, you can't really love him as yourself. So it's a different kind of love. But the mitzvah involves a number of responses. Obviously, if you love someone, you're going to be kind, you're going to be generous, you're going to be helpful. You also have to be defending. Part of Avas Yisrael is defending. Like the famous Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, the great lover of his fellow Jews. How did he express his love? He defended them to God. On every occasion, he found arguments that show that the Jews deserve better than what they're getting. So he always argued in their favor. We also find in the prophets, in the Navi, where a great Navi was asked to be the prophet and to be God's mouth to the world, and in his humility, the Navi said, I'm not fit for the job. I am impure of lip, and I live among a people who are impure of lip. Our mouths are not holy. God was very critical of this Navi. How dare you speak that way of the Jewish people? And an angel had to come with a burning coal and place it on his lip and purify his mouth because he said something negative about Jews. Now, first of all, he was a perfect saint. If anyone is in a position to criticize, certainly he was in a good position. He was not guilty or subject to the same failings as the people. Secondly, it's not much of a criticism. Impure of lips. It's not exactly condemning them. It's not passing judgment of punishment or suffering, God forbid. It's a slight, but it's a slight. And yet, it was so offensive to God that he had to wash his mouth with soap. So if a prophet has to be careful what he says about the ordinary folk, certainly ordinary folk have to be careful what they say about the Jewish people, about Jews in general, and about an individual Jew. So part of the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew is to always defend. Moshe, when God was angry at the people, defended the people. Even when they sinned grievously, making a golden calf, 40 days after being told not to make graven images, Moshe defended them. You can't be angry at your people. They don't deserve this. So we know that every time a Jew does a mitzvah, he creates a defense angel, an angel who will defend him, who will come before the heavenly courts and bring evidence that you did good, you're a good person, you mean well, you deserve all the blessings. When you do a sin, you create an angel who will act as the prosecution. Dig up every sin you ever did, put it up on the scale, and argue that things are not so good. Those are called the condemning angels. Certainly, we, as fellow Jews, must play the role of the defense lawyer, not of the prosecution. And that's why, even if we find in Torah that a person who commits this sin is punishable by this consequence or this punishment, our job is to argue that the person did not commit the sin, it wasn't intentional, it was out of ignorance, and even if he did do it, he also did many good things. We always argue in favor of the Jew. We never take the role of the prosecution. So you'll find in Torah where it says that a person who does such and such is going to suffer these consequences and he's going to be punished and it will be horrible. Our response should be, well, yeah, if a person is that bad, I'm sure there must have been people that bad who deserved that punishment, but not today, not any Jew I know. And in every generation, the good people always argued in favor of the sinner. So we needn't get confused. Doesn't it say in the Torah, if you do this sin, you're going to get, well, if you were intentional and if you were malicious and if you knew better and if all sorts of conditions. So it's interesting that there's a whole section in Torah about a false prophet. Got to be wary of false prophets. So the Torah says, if a man comes along, claims to be a prophet, speaking in the name of God, and he predicts what's going to happen, and it doesn't happen, then he is a false god. He should not be listened to. He should not be allowed to continue. However, if he's predicting some punishment or disaster, and it doesn't happen, this does not disqualify him. This does not prove that he is a false prophet. Because there are many things that God said would happen that would be terrible, and it didn't happen. Why? Because Jews did mitzvahs, Jews did tshuva, and that changes the verdict. However, if he predicts something good is going to happen, and it doesn't happen, then you know he's a false prophet. Now, why wouldn't you argue that that also doesn't disqualify him? God told him to predict good things, but then people went and messed up. So he's not a false prophet. He said what was true. Good things were going to happen, but then you blew it. You messed up, and now the promised good will not be delivered because you no longer deserve it. So we see, when God promises good, it's unconditional. When God promises, God forbid, negative, you can always fix it. It doesn't have to happen. So those prophecies that say that there has to be this kind of tragedy or that kind of, no, it doesn't have to happen. If we do our mitzvahs the way we're supposed to, it won't happen. So essential to the mitzvah of loving your fellow Jew is to always find a defense, to always see them as positive, to always see them as deserving. And that might be a little challenging because there are so many statements in Torah about dire consequences. When God said to Moshe, I am going to wipe them out. Done. I've had it with them. Pretty serious. Moshe was not impressed, and he was not intimidated, and he didn't believe it. And so he argued. Can't be that you're that angry. It can't be that they deserve. That's what a Jewish leader does. That's what every Jew does. So if it comes to a choice of taking literally, believing literally in all the punishments that are mentioned in Torah and all the dire consequences that come from sinning and from, you have to believe it's all true. It's in the Torah. On the other hand, in every judgment, there are conditions, circumstances, mitigating circumstances. So no judgment needs to be final. So when a good is promised, we have to pray that that happen. And when punishment is promised, we have to pray that it doesn't happen. we see in the Torah itself, God looks at every Jew as a tzaddik. Amech kulam tzaddikim. In God's eye, every Jew is righteous and every Jew is deserving of a portion in the world to come. Well, then what about all the punishment that God promises? The punishment fits the crime. If the crime is horrible, terrible, spiteful, malicious, evil intention, then yes, then this is the punishment. But God doesn't see Jews as malicious and intentional, even if the Jew claims to be malicious. So it's like the 6-year-old who gets angry at his mother and says, "You're not my mother anymore." No mother takes that seriously. Because you know that those are just words. The kid doesn't really mean it. That's how we're supposed to think of our fellow Jew. That's what we're supposed to understand from the Torah. So if somebody says to you, "Oh, it's written that if you do this and that, you're going to suffer in this world, you're going to suffer in the next world, you deserve to be..." Yep. That's all in theory if all the conditions are met. But we never agree that any Jew has met all those conditions. And that's why the Torah says, and you don't need to have chapter and verse to quote, like, where does it say that God loves us? Where does it say that God is compassionate? Where does it say that God is forgiving? Where does it say that God is long to anger? Where does it say all these things? That's the whole Torah. So, in the Torah it says that Jews are all righteous, that they're the apple of God's eye, and that anyone who criticizes the Jew is sinning and needs to have his mouth washed out. Even if the person criticizing is himself not guilty of any of those sins. But certainly if we ourselves are not so righteous, why would anybody take the position or the role of the prosecution, of the accuser? We refer to the Satan as the accuser. And God doesn't want to hear from the Satan. So, to upgrade our Avas Yisrael, we have to increase in our defense of every Jew, which really means our opinion of every Jew. What do you see when you look at a Jew? A sinful, corrupt, evil person? It's not exactly a good description. It's a godly soul that is a piece of God from above. Even the animal soul of a Jew is not all bad by its nature. It is, even by nature, kind and compassionate. And if a Jew does make mistakes and does commit sins and claims to do it intentionally, ask him to explain what a sin is. Ask him to explain what that punishment is. What does it mean to suffer after you're dead? If he doesn't know what it means, then he hasn't really been warned. He hasn't really been made aware of the seriousness of the sin or the consequence, because he doesn't understand what you're saying. If you don't warn a person, you can't punish the person. And to warn a person means to tell him what he can expect, But if you're telling him something he has no idea what you're talking about, something with the soul will go up, it'll go down. So in our times, after the Holocaust, we need to be 10 times more protective of every Jew than we were before the Holocaust. And before the Holocaust, every righteous Jew, every good Jewish leader, every kind-hearted and decent soul argued that Jews are not wrong and they're not bad. And if they make mistakes, it can be overlooked, it can be forgiven, it can be excused. Never, never do we deserve the exile and the suffering and so on. And that's before the Holocaust. Now, after a Holocaust, how could you possibly argue that what it says in Torah about evil people is referring to the Jew of today? The previous Rebbe, when he came to America, made this very strong emotional statement. We are here in a place of safety and comfort, and Jews in Europe are in terrible danger. Are we better than them? Is this supposed to tell us that we deserve better than those Jews? Not so. Here's what the Rebbe said. I consider every Jew in Europe a tzaddik, even if he doesn't put on tefillin. A tzaddik. That's a Jewish leader. That's Jewish thinking. We are never the accusing angel. We are always the defending angel. That is the minimum requirement in the mitzvah of Avas Yisrael. Part of the mitzvah of Purim is to share food products. Why did that become the custom? Because the Jews at the time of the event of Purim were not really united. One person would not eat at another person's house, not trusting the kashrut. After the miracle happened, the differences between them kind of faded, and they felt united. Yes, we are the Jewish people. We are the Mordechai. We are the Mordechai people. And then they shared their food because they trusted each other again. So one of the themes of Purim is the unity of the Jewish people. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that you'll eat from a person's house when the guy tells you that the food is not kosher. But a Jew who keeps kosher and tells you his house is kosher, there's no reason to suspect. So this is the occasion, a good occasion, to strengthen our Avas Yisrael, to focus on the fact that the Jewish people are awesome, if not in your evaluation, in God's evaluation. It's a very interesting. God tells Moshe to go notify the Jewish people in Egypt that the time of their redemption has come. Moshe says, but what if they don't believe me? How will I convince them? And God was critical of Moshe What do you mean they won't believe you? Why are you accusing Jews of not believing? That's another mild accusation. The Jews have been slaves. The Jews have been 210 years in Egypt. They're a little discouraged. Here a guy comes along. They don't know him. He comes along and he says, we're going out. We're leaving. It's not a terrible accusation to say they might not trust me or believe me. And yet God was offended. Don't talk like that about my kids. But the amazing thing is, God says, okay, I'll give you a sign. You'll perform this little wonder for them, and then they'll know that you're for real. And then God says, if they don't believe you even after the sign, I'll give you another sign. So listen to this. Moshe says they might not believe me. God is offended. But God himself says, I'll give you a sign to make them believe. But if one sign is not sufficient, and they still don't believe you, I'll give you a second sign. Which means God can say critical things about his children. God can threaten punishment and all sorts of things. He's the Father. But as a fellow Jew, we have to be really careful. So here's the final story on the subject, and that is the Rebbe Rashab was speaking to a chassid who was brokenhearted because he had lost his fortune. He went bankrupt. And he was devastated. A second chassid approached, heard what was being discussed, and he, I think with good intentions, said to the first chassid, it's all for the good. Don't be distressed. It's all for the good. Everything God does is for the good. A short while after that, the second chassid lost his fortune. And he came to the Rebbe Rashab and he was devastated. He was distraught. The Rebbe said to him, this happened to you because you justified God when the other chassid lost his fortune. You were supposed to be on his side. You were supposed to empathize with him, not justify it. And the consequence is that now you lost your fortune. The way to fix it is take out a loan. You still have some good credit. Take out a loan and give it to the other chassid and get him back on his feet. Let him start a business and get back to work. And then God will bless you that you will also. So here's such a strong, clear indication. You never justify the suffering of a fellow Jew. It's never okay with you. Even if you think you can explain it. It's not your job. It's not your job to bring down criticism and condemn Jews. There's an angel in charge of that, called the Satan. Let him do it. You argue in favor of Jews. And particularly in this happy month of Adar, where God showed that the Jewish people are special to him, even when they're in exile, even when they're partying with Ahasuerus. The Jew remains a Jew. And that's what we have to focus on.